Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in just a minute, just to make sure you're in the right place. This is Getting to Know Branch Versioning with Joe Peters from Esri. So give you a minute to get situated, and then we will get started. And to let you know, this is Joe's presentation will be the only session this hour. Our other presenter, Bill, with the Survey 1, 2, 3 session, could not make it. So if that's what you're expecting, sorry. This will just be the branch versioning with Joe for this hour. As you've probably seen in your other session, use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat may or may not be monitored by our moderator, but the Q&A will. And then if at the end you have any other questions or we can't get to everything in time, please feel free to reach out to Joe and he can help get those questions answered outside of this session. So with that, like I said, this is Joe from Esri on branch versioning. So take it away, Joe.
Okay. Oh, can you stop sharing so I can? Awesome. Hi, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Get my chat opened up, make sure we're all good to go. Can you just let me know that you can see my screen, Mariah and Teresa?
Yep, we can see it.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Joe Peters. I am a solution engineer with Esri. I live in the Denver area of Colorado. I support local governments in Arizona. So I work with mostly larger local governments, Pima County, Maricopa County, Phoenix, Tucson. So hopefully I know a lot of the folks on the line. If I haven't met you before, it's nice to meet you. I have my email address here in the chat, or sorry, on my screen here, rather, on my slide deck. And I'll be sharing the slide deck with anyone who's interested afterwards as well. There's some good resources in here on branch versioning. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into it. It's great to join you today. If anyone has questions, feel free to chat them in that or put them in that question window that you have available, and they'll share them with me. I have the full hour. I don't know if I'm going to take that, but feel free to just kind of jump in whenever, ask questions. This is kind of a dense topic, so it might even break it up a little bit and be kind of nice. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of branch versioning. So branch versioning, briefly, is a newish versioning type within our system. So it's been around for several years now, but it is newer than what we consider our traditional versioning type. It takes advantage of our services-based architecture. And so I think that that's a key tenet of why this was developed in the first place and what it allows us to do. Is that with that services-based architecture, we can move it outside of just the desktop, move it into other applications onto the web, et cetera. So it allows users to leverage versioning capabilities on the web. And this is something that is unique to branch versioning and is not possible with traditional versioning. So we'll talk about this new architecture along with other advantages and details. And one thing I'll mention, I was actually talking with Mariah, our moderator, before we started here. And one of the big drivers of this branch versioning type is really the ability to work with some of the more complex data models that we provide that are now services based. So that includes utility networks and the parcel fabric, which is all developed to use this branch versioning. So branch versioning was really, the development of it was driven by the needs put upon it by those data models that we're trying to persist in an enterprise environment. So my agenda here is to just provide a quick breakdown, a summary of versioning, and what that means within the context of ArcGIS. And then I'll talk about what branch versioning is specifically and a little bit about how it differs from traditional versioning and some of the benefits and best practices of that and why you might use branch versioning and actually some reasons why maybe we wouldn't use branch versioning. And after reviewing some of that general information, I'll discuss preparing and publishing branch version data. my understanding is that it's hard for us to connect to VPN while we're presenting. So what I did is my enterprise environment does require a VPN connection. So what I did is I did record a video that steps through the process of preparing and publishing a branch version data set. And I will essentially just roll that video for a little bit, come back into my slide deck, talk a little bit about editing details, and then I actually grabbed another video that is from some of the developers of branch versioning that will talk about the editing process and how that looks in ArcGIS Pro. And then we'll of course have questions at the end, but also feel free to fire them off whenever. So let's start with that quick summary of versioning that I mentioned. And versioning is Esri's long transaction model. And a long transaction model really takes a broad approach to tracking edits, and it assumes that a system is built up out of logical changes. So it focuses on the coordination and integration of those changes back into the system. So versioning is the architecture that supports undo and redo and editing and isolation within the framework of ArcGIS. So a version is a snapshot or representation of your data at any given state in your database. So these edits or for these versions are managed through a variety of system tables. And in multi-user editing scenarios, versions allow editors to work with the same data at the same time without applying locks or duplicating data by giving each editor their own unique isolated view of the data. So folks that have been using traditional versioning are probably familiar with these concepts. They've been around for quite a while. And I just want to level set with us just to make sure we're all kind of familiar with these concepts. And once an editor finishes collecting edits, they can merge those changes back to a parent version. And that parent version within the concept of versioning is called the default version. So you'll hear me use that term here a little bit. So that's just my high level overview of what versioning is in general. And let's talk a little bit about what branch versioning is. And to do so, maybe I'll just kind of set the stage that traditional versioning manages edits with a variety of different tables under the hood. So there's delta tables, and that's joined with some system tables. And those tables are then used to determine how to represent the data within any given version that an editor or viewer might be working with. So branch versioning actually does behave, especially to the end user, much the same as traditional versioning. So the end user's experience might not be too different between traditional versioning and branch versioning, but what's going on under the hood is substantially different. And so a couple of those things that I've already mentioned. One is that it's a services-based architecture. And another thing that's really important is that changes are actually tracked using a single table. So there's no related tables, and I'll talk about why that's of interest in a little bit. And really, branch versioning, it builds on the well-established capabilities of traditional versioning. So multi-user editing, and edit it in an isolated child version. You will see in this graphic, though, I did want to include this graphic because I do think it's interesting to observe that with branch versioning, all the children versions, so all the versions that are checked out and people are editing with, are off of default. Whereas in traditional versioning, we might have like children and grandchildren, so we might have copies on down the line. That is not possible with branch versioning. And a couple other things I want to make sure I mention. Just yeah, I think that's kind of good here. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about, oh, it was introduced at 10.6 and ArcGIS Pro 2.1. So hopefully with ArcGIS Pro, folks are using later versions. And I know with Enterprise, there can be a little bit of lag time with deployment of newer versions, but this has been around since 10.6. And of course, there's improvements and bug fixes and those kinds of things with every version. So let's talk about some of the benefits of implementing branch versioning. So there are a lot of benefits of versioning in general, but I'm just going to focus really specifically on branch versioning as it compares to traditional versioning. And so one of the main driving factors that I've mentioned already quite a bit is just this ability to support a services-based architecture, which means that we get the power of REST endpoint access. So we don't have to access the database directly. It also, because of the single table structure, branch versioning actually natively supports archiving. So this is something that with traditional versioning, you would actually have to enable archiving separately. With branch versioning, it just comes along for the ride automatically. Branch versioning also leverages editor tracking with an enhancement to also track deletes. And that's not currently supported with any other registration type. Queries are also optimized and streamlined because of that architecture of only having a single table. And then it's also a 24-hour system. So with traditional versioning, there's a compress that's required to push edits to the base table, and this prevents simultaneous editing. The post operation is also serialized, and that limits users to edit default while the post is occurring. And sometimes that can take quite a while with traditional versioning. So this just doesn't hold true for branch versioning. A compress is not required, and editing default while other users are posting is not blocked. So that's actually a huge advantage for folks that have used traditional versioning. You're probably all too familiar with that compression. And it's also a simplified administration. And that graphic I showed earlier, it's a flatter tree structure. There's no compress. There's no requirement to delete versions. And before I move on, I just want to mention, another aspect of the performance is often with traditional versioning, as a workflow kind of goes on for days, weeks, months, years, we might have multiple children. We might have lots of different Delta tables with a lot of different records in them. And that can sometimes slow down performance, sometimes substantially. So that's one of the benefits of branch versioning as well, is just having that single table with less information and less queries going across different tables that are joined together. So, oh, there's a question already. So does it work with geometric networks? And I'll address this actually in a slide or two, but that's a great question because the answer is no. A geometric network is one of those data types or data models that is specific to a database and an ArcGIS desktop or ArcMap workflow. And so branch versioning is not going to work with geometric networks. Where branch versioning does work is with a utility network, which is a newer data model that is built expressly to be leveraged in an enterprise environment. So geometric networks will not work. Okay, another question that came in: can a feature class and a web service that are edited in branch versioning support synchronize and replication? I believe, well, definitely synchronize. I believe replication as well. Can that same web service support offline and field maps? Yes, there is a workflow for that. And that's actually one of the big advantages of branch versioning, is the ability to do that. And one of the things you'll see when we actually get to the part of my presentation here where we're preparing and publishing the services, a lot of the steps that we have to take to synchronize a data set, adding global IDs, enabling editor tracking, that actually holds true for branch versioning as well. So a lot of those same steps are taking place, and it's because what we're trying to do with the data is actually at a foundational level, actually fairly similar. Good questions, keep them coming. So when to use branch versioning and when not? So a common misconception is that users need to move to branch versioning because it's the new technology. And that's not necessarily the case. I just want to note that there are some advantages to branch versioning that I just mentioned, and a lot of the system of ArcGIS is moving to this services-based architecture. But it is still important to choose the method that is really appropriate for your needs, for your workflow, for your project. And that may or may not be branch versioning. So it's more than acceptable to continue to use traditional versioning. Couple of examples where we would for sure use branch versioning. If it's services based, we would have to use branch versioning if we want a versioning workflow. These more complex data models that Esri is putting out to address specific needs and workflows within organizations, like the utility network for electric and gas and water, sewer. the parcel fabric, the new parcel fabric that is an ArcGIS Pro services-based product, as well as roads and highways. And then if you're connecting to SAP HANA, which is a very kind of specific type of database that actually requires branch versioning, yeah, that's where we use branch versioning. When not to, direct database connection. So if we're just editing in a desktop and we're connected directly to a database, then that's not a great place for it, or non-supported data sets, such as network data sets, or the question that came up earlier about geometric networks. So that would not be an ideal place for that. And in the resources slide at the end of my slide deck today, there's actually a nice blog post that I've linked to there that actually kind of talks about pros and cons with different situations. And there's some really good documentation about that as well. So I won't dwell on that too much, but just want to make the point that you don't always have to go the route of branch versioning. So does the REST endpoint have to be through ArcGIS Online, or can you have a server, ArcGIS server on your closed network and this still work? Okay, so that's a good question because it actually clarifies, and I apologize if I didn't clarify this already. So this workflow actually requires ArcGIS Enterprise and is not currently supported in ArcGIS Online. So the workflow for branch versioning requires a data set that is in an enterprise geodatabase. That geodatabase has to be a registered data store with an ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. So that would be your portal with an ArcGIS server, a data store, the web adapter, that kind of base deployment of ArcGIS Enterprise. And so this workflow is actually specifically for that ArcGIS server / enterprise workflow that includes the portal. So that's how this would work, because it does require that the data is in an enterprise geodatabase. It does not work with hosted feature services. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of roll this video here that I recorded that walks through the steps of preparing and publishing branch version data. And this is really kind of the bells and whistles of how you go from a data set that is not versioned, or basically not versioned, into a branch version data set. So some prerequisites for this, I'll outline this in the video, but I just want to highlight it here. So you have to be connected using a branch versioning database connection, and that's just a change that you make within ArcGIS Pro on the database itself. And then the data set, the individual data set within that database, must have global IDs, and editor tracking has to be enabled. And then we can actually go through the process of registering the data set as versioned and publishing it to our ArcGIS Enterprise environment so that we can make use of it. And there are some considerations here. If you're going to load data, it helps to be able to just do that ahead of time. Just get the data as close to the way you want it to be before you actually start doing any versioning work. Permissions are applied by the portal admin through the services architecture. And I think another way to read that would actually be that it makes use of the named user model in ArcGIS. So part of enabling editor tracking is allowing each user of the system to be tracked as they are making edits or changes within the data set. And so that's where your permissions are applied as well. So permissions to individual versions or permissions to default are actually now controlled at that level through the portal. And version management, there's a version management service that is actually started when you publish a data set that's been registered as branch version to ArcGIS Enterprise. And once you start that service, don't disable it if you want this versioning to continue to work. So that's a service on your server. So again, I mentioned this is kind of a dry topic, but these are kind of really important little details to know about. And I'm going to go ahead and roll this video. And if Teresa or you guys could let me know, make sure that you can hear my audio when I roll this.
Will do.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the steps that need to be taken to prepare and publish your data as branch versioned. The steps that I'm going to take today are actually outlined very nicely in this blog post that I have linked to in the resources slide in the slide deck that I'm presenting with today. This blog post does a really good job of kind of boiling it down to the nuts and bolts of what you actually have to do to make this happen. So the two primary steps involved are registering the data as branch versioned and then publishing to your ArcGIS Enterprise portal. But then, as I mentioned, there are a couple of prerequisites, and that's what this blog post does a good job of explaining, is making sure that you're updating your geodatabase connection to branch versioning. There's a couple of ways to go about that. Adding global IDs and enabling editor tracking. And then ultimately registering the data as versioned and publishing to your portal. And there are some couple of things that you need to be aware of when publishing to your portal, though the workflow is very similar for any other layers that you'd be publishing to your portal as well. There's just a couple of checkboxes that you need to make sure that you're aware of. So I'm going to go ahead and get into ArcGIS Pro and show you those steps. Okay, so here I am in ArcGIS Pro, and I have a data set that I want to register as branch version, and it's sitting in my Enterprise Geodatabase. So before I register as branch version, I do need to ensure that the database connection in ArcGIS Pro is explicitly set to branch for the versioning type. And there's a couple of ways that we can go about this. So the first way is I could actually right-click on the database connection in my catalog pane and open the geodatabase connection properties. Once that dialog opens, I can essentially just change the versioning type to branch. So easy peasy, that's one option to go about this. But there is an alternative method, and that method would be to use the geoprocessing tool. So in the analysis tab, I can open the geoprocessing pane by clicking on tools and then just search for the update geodatabase connection to branch geoprocessing tool. And the nice thing about having a geoprocessing tool, that means that we could script it if we wanted to. If we wanted to automate any steps along this process, we can using these geoprocessing tools. So we can go ahead and let that tool run. And then once it's done executing, we can just go ahead and confirm that the changes that we've made to the versioning type have actually taken. So let's go back into the catalog pane, go back to our database, right click, open the geodatabase connection properties, and just confirm that the branch versioning type is now selected. Okay, now for each feature class that we want to register as branch version, there's a couple of steps that we need to perform. So the first step that we're going to do is to actually add global IDs. We can locate this feature class in our Enterprise Geodatabase, right click, click Manage, and then simply add global IDs in this way. Or we can do what we did in the previous step, where we can actually search for the geoprocessing tool. So two options, we get to the same place with either of these options. Using the geoprocessing tool again is nice, because if we did want to build a model or script it, we do have that option. So we'll go ahead and just find our input data set in the Add Global IDs geoprocessing tool, click Run, let that execute. And once the geoprocessing tool is complete, we can essentially verify that that worked as expected by highlighting the layer in our contents pane, going to the Data tab, and then opening the fields for this particular feature class, and just verifying that the global ID field is now present in the table. So there's our global ID, and we can move on to our next step. We're going to go ahead and enable editor tracking. This allows the base table to automatically record history for each add, update, and delete edit, and it will also record the portal user's name and save timestamps. So I'm going to go ahead and search for the Enable Editor Tracking geoprocessing tool. I'm going to open that tool up and select my input data set. And this data set does not have fields to store this information in yet, so I'm going to go ahead and use this tool to add it. So I'm going to select the Add Fields checkbox. And then I actually have to specify what I want these fields to be named. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go with sort of defaults for this. So creator, creator date, last editor, and last editor date. And once I have that filled out, I can go ahead and click Run to execute the geoprocessing tool.
Once that's completed, I can go ahead and do the same thing I did in the previous step and just verify that those fields have actually been added to our data set. All right, and we see at the top of our table here, we have these fields that we've just added using the Enable Editor Tracking Geoprocessing tool, so we can move on to our next step. So before I actually go ahead and register this data set as versioned, I'm going to take one final step here to properly safeguard the default version to make sure that it doesn't get edited by somebody else down the line. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my contents pane, make sure that my list by data source option is selected in the contents pane, find my default database and say manage versions and change the access property to protected, and then just go ahead and save this. Once that's saved, I can close this table and then essentially go ahead and take that final step of registering this as versioned. So I'll go into right click on the data set itself, go into manage, and then say register as versioned. Now that we have taken all the steps to register the dataset as versioned, I can actually go ahead and start publishing this to our portal. So first step, I want to just make sure that I am in fact logged in to my enterprise production portal. You can see my portal here. I can right click on this layer now. And just like I would with other data layers that I want to share to our portal, I can say sharing and share as web layer. And that will open our sharing pane. I'm just going to go ahead and throw in a couple of quick summary and tag information here. This is going to be a referenced layer. So we have an enterprise geodatabase that is already referenced as a data store with our ArcGIS enterprise deployment. So that's very important to know about. We have map image selected, but with this particular workflow, we also need to make sure this checkbox to enable feature layer access is enabled. And then we're going to go into our configuration settings and ensure that the capability for version management is selected as well. So I can analyze this. And I will get a warning message saying that the layer name exposes a fully qualified data set. In this case, I could go ahead and change that name in the contents pane. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and let that go. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this layer. And so those are the steps. That's how we can go from a layer that is not branch versioned to a layer that is branch versioned and get that layer published to our enterprise portals.
Well, awesome. So appreciate you guys watching that video. Apologize for the low production quality. I kind of scrambled to put that together today. You'd be amazed how much time it takes to put a 7-minute video together. But that is the whole workflow for preparing a data set and publishing it as version. So that's as long as we have an ArcGIS enterprise environment, an enterprise database, access to ArcGIS Pro, we're an administrator, we can make that workflow happen. One point I do want to make is that there isn't really what we would consider like a migration path from traditional versioning to branch versioning. So the method to go from one to the other is really to back out of traditional versioning. So reconcile, post, compress your database, and then essentially go and step through this process of branch versioning. They're two completely different mechanisms or kind of data model types for accomplishing this version. So we actually have to kind of back out of one and move into the other if that's the direction we want to go. So just something to be aware of. I want to make sure I make that point. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is actually really another video that I grabbed from one of the developers from one of their UC presentations, is the editing workflow. So now that we have actually published our data set as a versioned data layer, it is available as an item in ArcGIS Enterprise, and we can pull that item into ArcGIS Pro. We can pull it into field map applications we can pull into other places, but how do we actually begin to work with that? Especially in this case, we're going to be focusing on the editing of data by users or editors within the ArcGIS Pro environment. And I saw that there was a good question that came through about field applications and how about using branch versioning in field apps. And absolutely, there's a workflow for that. I can pull up the documentation for that towards the end of my presentation, but also if you just get into your browser and type a search for branch versioning with ArcGIS field maps, you should come up with a documentation for that. That's a well-documented workflow and one of the big drivers behind doing this branch versioning. So I'm going to go ahead and play the second video.
As seen in the top right corner, I'm currently connected to my portal as the editor user. On the left, in the Data Sources tab, you can see that I'm automatically connected to the default version since I just added my data to the map. Before we change over to a named version to edit, I want to demonstrate the user experience editing the default version when its access level is set to protected and we're editing as a non-version administrator user. I'm currently in my area of interest, and I'm going to attempt to change an attribute on a building. I'm going to do this by accessing the Edit ribbon, selecting the appropriate building, and clicking the Attributes button to open the Attributes pane. There have been some proposed changes in this area, where the residential buildings are now mixed use. I am therefore going to change the assigned building type. You will notice that I received an error on attempting to edit this building attribute. This is because the default version is set to protected, prohibiting users from editing and making accidental alterations. Only users with higher privileges can edit and post to the default version when it is set to protected. It's important for organizations to determine the appropriate access level of the default version, as the default version is typically seen as the most current and accurate state of the data. On the Data Sources tab, I'm going to select the default version to enable the Versioning Contextual tab. In this ribbon, I can complete a variety of versioning tasks, such as managing my versions, creating a new version, and reconciling and posting. I already have a version which I want to use. Therefore, I'm going to click the Change Version button, navigate to the version I want to work with, which is my proposal version, and click OK. When connected to another version, the version is illustrated in the Data Source tab to show which version I'm actively editing. Like our attempted edit on default, I'm going to proceed with changing the building type of a couple of buildings to mixed use, as well as delete a building which was recently removed from the proposal. I'll complete these edits by selecting the appropriate building, clicking the Attributes button, and updating the attribute in the Attribute pane. For the second building, I will follow the same workflow, where I am again going to set the building type to mixed use as well. Finally, I will delete this last building by selecting the feature and clicking the Delete button on the Edit tab. Notice that in the top left corner, I can undo and redo my edits. This is because we're editing against a named version which uses long transactions during editing. Edits will also not be committed to my branch until I hit Save. Now that we've completed the edits in our named version, we can reconcile to pull edits from default to our version and see if our edits cause any conflicts. To reconcile, we'll select our version in the Data Source tab, activate the Version Contextual tab, and click the Reconcile button. For the purpose of this demo, we'll use the option to reconcile by object. A dialog popped up after reconciling, indicating that there are conflicts. This means that the same features were edited in the default version, and we need to determine which edits should be used to represent our data accurately. So let's look at the conflicts. by clicking Yes, agreeing to open the Conflict Manager. The Conflict Manager will show all feature classes which have conflicts. Expanding the results set will divide the conflicts in categories of the conflict type, and finally the object IDs which are in conflict. The conflict display can also be expanded to show the spatial representation of the feature, which can be useful in determining geometry changes. In this specific case, we can see that the building was deleted in my version, while the building type attribute was updated in default. As an editor, it is important that I review these conflicts to confirm that I did not make any mistakes while editing, but also to provide notes that could help the version administrator when they complete QA against the version. The first edit shows that it was deleted in my version, but updated in the default version. I recall having a meeting regarding this building where, although it was planned to be renovated, it was decided to be demolished because it wasn't in good enough condition. Therefore, I'm going to add a note to the version administrator reminding them of the meeting we had by right-clicking on the object ID and selecting Add Review Note. Since I am confident with these edits, I'm also going to mark this conflict as reviewed. The second edit shows that the features was updated in my version with a new building type and deleted in the default version. It is possible that this is yet another building that was planned for renovation but did not meet sufficient building standards, but I do not recall. Although I believe my edit is appropriate, I will leave it unchanged for the version administrator to review. This final edit shows that the conflict is a result of updating the building type in both my version and the default version. I recall now that this building was indeed getting reclassified as commercial. I can therefore choose to change my feature to reflect the changes made in default by right-clicking the object ID and using the Replace with Target Version option. Again, I'm going to mark this conflict as reviewed because I am confident in my edits. One quick feature I would like to point out while we are here is the option to filter reviewed conflicts. This allows users to hide conflicts they've already reviewed, making it much easier to manage the conflicts, especially in scenarios where many conflicts are present. Now that I completed reviewing my conflicts, I'm going to save my changes and close the conflict manager. Now that I'm confident with my edits, I need to inform a version administrator that I'm done with my version and that they need to review my edits. I have therefore messaged John to let him know that I would like for him to review my version. For John or another version administrator to complete the QA process, I need to make sure that there are no locks in my version so that they can connect and edit. I am therefore going to change to the default version to release my lock. Other options to release my lock would be to remove the service from the map or simply close the application. John can now connect to my version and review my edits.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead.
All right, so that was a review of editing workflows and how that looks in ArcGIS Pro and some of the tools that you have available, how you can access different versions. I want to make one point. I didn't really include in this the kind of the last piece of this, which would be the administration of these different versions, reconciling and posting, managing different versions. I think a question actually came up about that. There is a set of tools for managing these different versions. This is Brentford Pro. So there was a question, does it make a version every time someone pulls it from portal? The answer is no. So an administrator can choose which versions they're creating, who they're providing access to. That's all controlled again through that named user model. And so there's actually another question about doing this with field maps. I can see if I can pull up the documentation actually when I'm done presenting here, but in that workflow, there's documentation about actually creating a different version for each offline map that you're creating. So that's one option for doing that. So there's control over these versions. I didn't get too much into that in this demonstration, but I'll show you where there is the presentation that I actually pulled that last video from is available on YouTube, and that's in the resources. And if you're interested in that administration piece, if you've gotten this far, you probably are. That video, you can watch it and they'll walk through the same steps that just like they did, but with that administration component. A couple questions that came up. UTC, does branch versioning feature classes only support UTC? That was what I had selected in the video that I played when I shared the version data set to ArcGIS Enterprise, but you actually could, I think the alternate option, there was a drop down there. You could do UTC or whatever the time component is for the database itself. So I don't think you're necessarily tied to UTC. I think you can go with alternatives. Is the map image setting analogous to the map server without feature access enabled? Yes, that's correct. So that checkbox, I think the wording or the terminology I might have used, and I think even the way that we label it in ArcGIS Pro has changed over time, but essentially that feature access is just enabling access to the features to query and edit and update and all those kinds of things. And so I might have stated map image versus map server wrong, but same capability. And is this available in ArcMap? And so the answer is no. And you know, if anyone was in my presentation yesterday about Workflow Manager, and one of the big points of that product is that it is a services-based architecture, and you've definitely heard me use that term a lot here. The big differentiator between ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro, when it really comes down to it, the whole reason that ArcGIS Pro was developed in the first place is that services-based architecture. The fact that we can pull in a feature service through an item in the portal or ArcGIS Online, and it behaves the same way it would as though it was in a web map or in a mobile app. That is really what I see as being the foundation of what ArcGIS Pro provides. And unfortunately, ArcMap just wasn't capable of that. So this branch versioning capability that we're discussing today is not available in ArcMap. So really good question. I know there's still a lot of users on ArcMap, and great question. So I'm glad someone asked it. So in summary, branch versioning is a newish versioning type. It is, again, that services-based architecture. It's not a replacement for traditional versioning. It offers simplified administration, and it's a 24-hour system. And it's hopefully easy to prepare and publish data. And here's some resources. I did mention that video. This Getting to Know Branch Versioning video is actually where I grabbed that little video that I just showed. And there's also another video that is version management in ArcGIS. I think I'm actually going to go to this because I mentioned this. So this blog post, branch versioning, setting the stage, really good blog post that does boil this down very nicely. There is also this blog post that talks about, oh wait, is that the one? Hang on. There's this one, which is to branch or not to branch. So a good blog post that talks about whether branch versioning would be appropriate for what you're working on or not. I think that's a really good one. And then also the documentation itself. So documentation, I think, is fairly thorough here. And the other thing I'll mention as far as resources goes, we do have some good training on this. So There's, I believe, some virtual training on this topic. There's definitely some instructor-led training. We cover this in the administration workflows class. So the ArcGIS Enterprise Administration Workflows class steps through this, as well as I believe there's actually an instructor-led one-day course that is solely focused on branch versioning. So there's lots of good resources out there for this if you're so inclined. And with that, I'll kind of wrap up here. I think that's what I have for you. I'll leave that up, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to fire away.
So I'm not sure if you answered this question, Joseph. I'm going to just read it verbatim. You stated earlier branch versioning requirements must be in ArcGIS Enterprise portal in an enterprise geodatabase. The question is, does it support a feature class that are in an ArcGIS Enterprise data store file geodatabase and not a relational geodatabase?
Okay. Oh, okay. I see where you typed that as well. So I believe that the data actually has to be in an enterprise geodatabase. I believe that versioning requires an enterprise geodatabase. I can confirm that. If whoever wrote that actually, I'll go to my next slide here because it does have my somewhat unusual email address. So it's joseph_peters@esri.com. Whoever wrote that, if you want to send me an email, I can follow up. I'm almost positive it actually requires an enterprise geodatabase. So that would be the answer there.
And I'm going to just ditto that with, I think you're correct.
Okay.
And I know that Mariah's going to cover this in the end, but if you just go to the community and the attendees, you will also see Joseph Peterson's email address to email him any questions. Several people have asked also about a copy of this presentation. That too as well will be provided in a couple of hours after this presentation. You'll find it online. I think that's all the questions. I think you have answered them throughout your talk. Is there anything else? Let me just go look in the chat really fast, make sure. Not finding anything. So great presentation.
Yes, and thank you you made a good use of the time for originally having it half this time.
It's a good thing I didn't just have 30 minutes. I know this is a dense topic, so thanks everyone for sticking with me. Happy branch versioning.
There is one question that just popped up real quick. Can I ask the inverse of the question asked earlier? We have our data in an Arc Enterprise geodatabase, which we fully control, but we do not have control over the Arc Enterprise portal settings. Is there a way to implement branch versioning in this context?
I assume that means that you're not an administrator in the portal. And I'm not necessarily sure that you would have to be, as long as you have those capabilities on the database. I think you might be able to get away with publishing privileges with this workflow, but that's also something, if you want to email me about, we could confirm that. And to confirm that, I could even go as far as just testing it on our system by changing my user roles and seeing what happens.
And there's one more question. Oh, go ahead, Mariah. Say it.
No. Does Esri have any plans to do this with hosted feature services?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm glad someone asked that. So hosted feature services, that's the number one what ArcGIS Online uses, and I think that's the big use case. But then also with ArcGIS Enterprise, part of the deployment of an ArcGIS Enterprise based deployment is a component of our technology called a data store. And so that data store is actually an install. It's a managed database, and you can host or publish hosted feature services to ArcGIS Enterprise. So you could do that either in Enterprise now or like we do in ArcGIS Online. As far as I have heard, there is no plan to create a version workflow as hosted feature services. And I think the reason that there's no plan for that is there's just simply limitations with hosted feature services that would require more engineering than the development team sees it being worth at this time. And they feel that version workflows really should require, I guess, an enterprise database and an ArcGIS enterprise deployment. I think that would be awesome to see in hosted feature services, but I know it's just not currently on the roadmap because of those limitations. Good question.
I think unless anybody submits any last minute, I think you've covered a lot, very informative. I think you made a dry topic not so dry, and a lot of interaction with the crowd. So definitely thank you for presenting and sharing your expertise with us. Again, if anybody has any further questions, like Teresa said, you can go to the attendee portal and the community page and find him in this list, or as Teresa put in the chat earlier, his email address. Again, thank you all for participating and joining in. Thank you, Joseph, again for presenting with us. And I think we can call it a day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.